amplified pattern recognition.
Why does the universe exist? We're about 5 Einsteins away from the answer.
Welcome to Think Tank. This is a podcast where in each episode we pick a topic and then we discuss it with industry professionals and thought leaders in that industry. I'm Josh Gonzalez.
And I'm Braeden Drew, and we're your hosts of Think Tank. This is episode 10 on disaster and emergency management. Our first guest is Jen Duke Holmes, the founder of Dem Hub, which is an online platform used to aid in disaster and emergency management situations. Our next guest is Mark Therien, who works with Jen and is an academic in disaster and emergency management.
Jen and Mark bring some very enlightening and knowledgeable perspectives on this topic. This episode is a global and holistic talk on the emergency management industry and how it's so new, and how Dem Hub will be a platform to innovate this entire industry. So let's get right into it. Tell us where you have been in the industry leading up until now and like what you're doing now.
Sure. My name's Jennifer Duke Holmes. My background in this industry, in the disaster and emergency management industry, has been in a leadership role with the Red Cross doing disaster response issues. Doesn't matter if there were exercises or if it happened to be the ice storm in 2012. When I would go on these exercises or long-term responses with the Red Cross, I always took my camera. It allowed me to be creative. It allowed me to tell the story because I find that these stories are so important to tell. So that's how I started to build my career, was in that direction.
And then from there, is that how you kind of came up with the idea for Dem Hub, or how did that all start? Like, why don't you tell us a little bit about Dem Hub and exactly what you guys are doing and how that work relates to what you're doing now?
Dem Hub was actually, and not related to this in particular, but it's in a response to being in an environment where people were constantly saying, I need this, I need that, and we have this problem and we have that problem, and just being so new to the industry, I was only witness to it. Existing in a space where multimedia, digital media, living in the new world for solution-based stuff is, to me, it was about being being more collective and being more the contributions that everybody had that they could put together would be really beneficial in solving a lot of the problems. Sharing information being one of them, knowledge sharing. When I was thinking about solutions to this problem, because I was getting frustrated listening to the same thing over and over again, that's the type of person I am. I'm like, there's a problem and we need to fix it. So coming up with Dem Hub was something that I thought about doing long before. And it was just simply about putting a platform together where people could share that information. The premise of Dem Hub is to take people's information and put people themselves into what is professional network, essentially.
And so, Mark, where have you been in the industry, and how did you come across this, and how are you getting involved?
My industry involvement it's not as much as with Jen. Like Jen, I've worked with the Red Cross. I've volunteered. In the past, I was working with what they call the personal disaster assistance. And basically, it's answering to like small emergencies, like let's say house fires or building fires, and you get called in. Did some things like just on heat alert days, bring water. What I've started volunteering with the Red Cross again, and I think this is much more pertinent in the direction I want to go in. And so I'm volunteering in a program called First Contact, which is works with refugee and migrant services. And one thing I've learned going to school with emergency management academically being a very new field, one thing that was being pushed is trying to think outside the box. And that's the one thing is a lot of the stuff that was happening with professors, they were talking about there's a lot of focus on response and recovery, a lot on the physical nature, on the technology. But they also, what I talked about when we talked about social science and stuff, they wanted to start pushing that a lot more. And so what I really think with this is like you get into a network, a community of people, like-minded people who are in the industry. Some may be doing it academically, some budding, and you can actually start conversations and think outside the box and bring in new ideas and on a global scale.
Yeah, that's amazing. Like research from here, and then, like you said, some media from over here, like what we've actually seen and some stories of these places. And how do you put that together? Is that the idea that this platform would bring together? Like storytellers, researchers, actual workers? Like what kind of things do you really envision for people to be doing on this?
Absolutely. Any way that we learn is, I think, and that's what we have to make it really diverse, because if we're going to be a global platform, we have to make sure that we're actually dishing out as much as we can in different formats, right? And that's where the multimedia aspect comes in. That's where the digital, like digitizing as much as we can, is going to be really beneficial. Dem Hub in and of itself is a professional network. It's really a really simple concept, and knowing what it was that I wanted to do, I had to figure out what's the right platform to do it on. And found out that there's these new types of social networks. They're social professional networks, essentially, which are called vertical professional networks, as opposed to being like Facebook and LinkedIn.
So what's an example of that, of the vertical networks?
Probably the most popular one is LinkedIn, but only if you take it from the perspective of the recruiter or the HR.
Right, yeah, recruiters, because people actually pay for that, like $40 to $80 a month. Like recruiters actually pay money.
Exactly.
I didn't know that. I had no idea LinkedIn actually had a premium version.
Yeah, it does. And it's an effective one, obviously, right?
Yeah.
There's also academia.edu. ResearchGate is also another one out there. So these are all actually pinpointing that we are your resource if you are a scientist, if you are a researcher, if you are a doctor, if you are, so on and so forth. And why that these things are coming up is for the very reason that we're talking about, is that, the social networks are not very comfortable. I don't want to mix my social and my professional. It's very diluted, so I'm not getting that, that transfer of knowledge. So that's why this is the type of platform that is, we're trying to create with Dem Hub. There's a lot of research out there. There's a lot of people that are in the thick of it, that are coming out and they're writing, these essays or these theses or, whatever it is that they're putting together. But who's reading them? I mean, they're so valuable, but nobody's reading them.
Right, it's just going to go into like an archive, and maybe the professor might read it.
And we can't afford that.
Because where does it go? Where do those things go? Where do research papers go right now, and how can people access it to get this information?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a few repositories that are,
Depends where you write them and where
exactly,
you put them
right?
to.
And it's in the dark corners of the internet, if they are on the internet. It's like, how do you even get to that?
Exactly. So why are we not taking the golden nuggets from these lessons learned from these articles and putting them into manageable, entertaining formats? And when I say entertaining, I don't mean like show and tell, dance kind of. I mean entertaining in a captivating sense, so that the message is getting to the people that need it, so that they can incorporate it, to build something that is absolutely industry driven. And it's not just emergency managers, it's scientists that deal with seismology, volcanology, epidemiology, all of these experts talking to the people that have to make the plans and making sure that even the people that have to make the plans are borrowing from each other. Like, what have you done? And
Totally.
What am I missing? So that's the kind of relationship that we're just trying to foster.
Yeah, you're basically explaining like the ideal platform that can implement on almost any problem solving, like whatever problem that arises. You want a scientist can solve the problem in the science way, but then you're also going to need someone who's really good on the social aspect, and then you're going to have someone on
The technology aspect as well.
For it to be collaborative, for someone to say that I am the best there is at this means that they're going to be bad at something else. So you need more. You need to get like a full rounded effect in terms of an answer or a solution. You need almost multiple. You need more people who have various aspects and backgrounds who are all like fully fledged PhDs and because like they'll know more than you on this, and so you can't have only scientists solving all the problems because there's other problems that arise that they won't be able to solve.
Yeah, how would you foster that cross collaboration?
Well, that's one of those things that organically is going to kind of come out of the whole project, right? So just the nature of emergency management, and Mark can attest to this, it's even a disaster or an emergency situation, I'll even say here in Toronto, the table has to be full of diversity. You have to have your first responders. You have to have your critical infrastructure. You have to have your hospitals. You have to have, or your public health in this case. You have to have, all of these people, transportation at the table. You have to have the heads of these people because all of this gets affected. And if that is at its micro level, the very basic thing we do, so at a macro level, we need the same thing, right? So if we're up against West Nile, or if we're up against, Ebola, for example, maybe there's somebody who's over in West Africa that's on the platform and is sharing tidbits, or I can ask a question to. and then and try to prepare my hospital accordingly based on this information, and then see what other hospitals, maybe even the airports, like how many people are coming in from West Africa that I got to keep my head up for. So that's where you need to make sure that you have the proper procedures in place at that level before it gets out into the population.
So would you say, in terms of disasters, how no disaster is the same? They all have different ripples through societies and different countries and have different outcomes and stuff like that. Would you say that your platform would be like a faster solution in terms of like finding certain ways to like get the right help where it needs to be? And
well, the one thing that you bring, it's not a very simple question to answer. You bring in a lot of stuff, and the one thing that is very interesting you bring in that no two disasters are alike, and it's very true. You can have an earthquake here, and you can have an earthquake over in East Africa, and it'll affect it differently. One thing I also wanted to go back to is what you said when you brought up artists. You kind of bring up art into like emergency management disasters, and there is actually an importance there, and because there's a lot of cultures globally we all know that rely more on art. That be music, dancing, a lot more heavily, I'd say, than Western culture per se. I think it's really important because I remember I was doing research on a disaster in Cameroon in 1986 called the Lake Nyos disaster, which is a gasified lake. There's like 3 in the world, 3 or 4. And I wrote a paper on it, and it happened overnight. They think a rock slide happened and went into the lake and created a gas explosion out of the lake and killed thousands and thousands of people. What I found really interesting in that whole situation when I was doing my research is how they talked about how that lake's been there for thousands and thousands of years. So has people living there, civilization. And the one thing they talked about is that how did people survive all those years, as experts were talking about how can we degasify the lake, how can we make it safer. But one thing they brought up was the fact that they believe through folklore and through song, they believe that it was written into that, in their folklore and their songs, that you had to go up to high places to avoid the gas.
The gas, yeah.
And so a lot of times, a lot of their communities in the past were living in higher altitudes, and then it was only in recent times they started going down to lower altitudes and living there because the soil is more fertile. And in my paper, I kind of myself self-indulgently claimed something called mythological mitigation, and I kind of proposed the fact that, we could sit here and create all these technologies and these early warning systems or put pipes in the lake like they've done for Lake Nyos now. But we also can't just negate the fact that culture and this songs and like dance can actually prepare and get the message out to people. And so especially in more isolated communities, through this, they can actually have knowledge and knowledge sharing, but not through the conventional sense of right now in modern times, let's say, using like Dem Hub, the internet. But that's what I find really interesting.
And that's even an interesting point is Dr. Brian Fagan, actually. He's from California, and he spoke at the International Association for Emergency Managers, and he was a keynote speaker, and he was so captivating. And he kept putting up on screen paintings from all different eras, and it was showing something in that, and he recognized that as a disaster, a response to a disaster. And then he put that in a timeline with what we know has occurred in the past. And he said that painting is in response to this disaster that occurred at this period of time. And what they're showing us is how they recovered or how they responded or how they reacted to that. So there was a lot of information in the art that came from a particular disaster incident. If it didn't matter if it happened to be a volcano that, now they live under a cloud and they can't grow food and there was a famine. So these are the things that are type of relatable where we can actually solve mysteries from the past. And so it just shows, it kind of goes to the argument to why we need so many people that are interrelated to disasters to have access to them. Because somebody who's an anthropologist or a sociologist would be able to give us insight on, if I put this plan into effect, what do you think both positive and outcomes could be that I haven't considered?
Or possible negative outcomes, which is even worse, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and we've talked about geography before when we've got together, specifically about living in Canada and being here in Ontario, where we have, the most fresh water. And like, what do you see that being a potential like disaster in the future? Where, I mean, obviously our fresh water supplies are depleting, but what does that mean for us as Canadians?
Well, I'll start with this. I'm sure Mark will jump in, but right away we would actually, if I was to pose that to a group of emergency managers, they'd probably say, well, that's not an emergency management issue. And my argument is, okay, yet.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Yet.
But it will be.
Well, when we look
hopefully not, but the way things are going now, it potentially can be.
It has a lot of potential. And the reason why I say this is I'll give you two examples as to where the argument has come into play as to whether or not a particular thing is a disaster emergency management issue. So fracking. Fracking is definitely has its economics. It's got a lot of negative feedback from people, especially, there's a lot of groups that are saying this is not good for the environment. But fracking has actually been linked directly to earthquakes. And so the argument there isn't whether or not you believe as an emergency manager that climate change is, our quote unquote issue. There's no discrepancy here that anybody can put on the table that says that earthquakes are not. So, that was one of the things. And the other thing was train derailment. The question is now what is it that we're looking for that where we check off the boxes that this is an emergency management issue, and is probably, in my mind, how many resources are we using to deal with an issue? How many in first response are we using all of the ones that I said had to be at the table? So if we're using a large number of resources in order to address in a response issue, then I think that becomes an emergency management issue. And I'll turn that over to Mark to see what else he has to say on the issue. But
well, the one thing I think which ties into just Dem Hub talk about media is sensationalism. And a lot of times certain disasters or emergencies come to the forefront because something happens and it just becomes a media sensation.
And boost their ratings, and people share it all over Twitter. Exactly. So how do you,
And that's what happens. And then, so now, as you see that, she mentioned these derailments, and now it's been pushed, and now it's like, okay, we need to put some money, we need to put some resources in there. And a lot of it comes down to, it is managing resources, and there's budgets that come into play. I find it funny that you mentioned water when we're drinking water of these Pure Life Nestle bottles. We talk about the economics of water, and it's funny that you brought.
Nobody had to know that, though.
It's Pure Life.
Everyone listening is Pure Life. That's why. Actually, no. See, everybody in this room except for me has a plastic bottle. I just want to put it out there. I'm using a reusable bottle, and I did that consciously. So. Just a little heads up there.
Ouch.
Well, Josh, I'd just like to point out I did notice that as I looked across the table.
Yeah. Just kidding. I see Chris in our control room just like giving me the okay. He's even using a plastic bottle. But I
gave him that one.
Oh, so it's your fault then. You're destroying this planet.
It's not.
It's one of the R's he's reusing.
And it's all good. It's all
See
good.
how all of a sudden it becomes an extremely conscious thing.
Yeah, it's
that
really
it's like,
funny.
oh my God, I am actually contributing to the demise of my society as I sit here and try to come up with conclusions.
It's going to slowly change. But sorry, moving on.
Yeah, not a problem.
Maybe you don't know what this is made out of.
Yeah, that's true.
That to be extracted could be more detrimental to the environment than even the.
Oh yeah, it could have been like 50,000 of those.
Like who knows? You can't just wait. Oh, this is reusable. It doesn't matter. It's like what metal is in it.
We're talking about more taking the water from the Canadian supplies to resell. To
Hey, these bottles too are a thing. If you've seen those mountains in India, you'd probably
it's
discuss
pretty
those.
scary.
That's because India has too many people.
They ship. You think these get recycled? A lot of them just get shipped over there.
Exactly.
And so what's funny when we bring this up is when I met with her earlier this week or late last week, I kind of talked about the socioeconomics of disasters, and actually we were talking about kind of mitigating right now by like you're bringing something out, and an emergency manager might say, no, that's not an emergency management issue, but will it be one? And so one thing I really talk about is also the politics and geopolitics of things. And one thing is, yes, Canada has all this fresh water. And one of the biggest things right now is selling our water. And that's starting to happen more and more. You're starting to see this. You're seeing Nestle buying water. And through all these international trade agreements, it makes it harder and harder for us to protect waters. And this gets complicated because now we're getting this world globalization where we're trying to drop down borders and share everything. But when you've exhausted resources at other places and we have all this water, it's just now these companies are coming in, they're extracting water but what's going back in?
Exactly.
Water's being extracted more faster than the earth can replenish it, but we need water.
So are they responding to that now? Are they even talking about it?
Oh, it's being talked about. Whether they're really doing anything about it,
nothing's going to be done. It's almost like it's the chicken or the egg conversation, because there's certain problems that arise that can be seen through Dem Hub.
People talk about it.
And they won't even deem it as a disaster until it goes through probably a certain number of stages. Because when you look at certain areas around the world, different places on the planet have different numbers of resources for a certain reason. And so I don't think it's not like an allocation of where we should move resources around. It's where we should move people around.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the concept, and we say it all the time, if a tree falls in the forest, does anybody hear? And if there is a hurricane in the ocean, it's not a disaster unless it hits a major city, or if it hits land and it affects somebody's life or property. And otherwise, it's just a hurricane. You know, we're in the way.
What I really get from this is like this huge economic kind of structure around all of this. I mean, that's one huge part of this larger circle of Dem Hub. I mean, when you think about it, if water, the price tag's going to keep going up, and like this food price tag keeps going up, it's harder and harder to eat. What's going to happen when our air, where we have like not enough air? We already see it in China. People are literally selling bottles of air. How far are we really going to go in this like capitalist kind of mindset? Is it like maybe a whole systematic problem that needs to change for the world to change? Because everything is connected. And like you're saying, everything literally plays in each other. Sociology, everything is connected. It's not just one thing. It's everything put together.
I think everything has a breaking point.
You have to go back to the roundtable aspect where you said, you need all these people to solve a problem. The problem is not everybody at the table has the same voice. You have different rates of disasters. You have natural disasters that come out of nowhere. You have a hurricane, devastates a town, you have an earthquake, and so like that needs immediate responses. But then you have almost like a second tier form of disasters, which can have same like scale of implications in terms of a negative impact on us, but they're happening at a slower rate. So when you look at your 10-year margin or your projection, where you're like, oh, what do I have to plan for now? They obviously continuously put off those things because they're on such a slow time scale.
So being more long-sighted rather than the short-sightedness.
Well, I think the term you're looking for is a creeping disaster.
Thank you.
Right.
And I think that what you were alluding to, Braeden, is actually what we call a risk analysis. So we have this ability to basically put on paper what our number one threats are. So we kind of, we with a matrix, we kind of put that together. And so you address obviously the most pressing issues, and every geolocation is going to have a different pressing issue. And then you also look at the social factors that are involved in that. In that matter, we're able to kind of not overwhelm ourselves with all the things that we have to consider. And that's kind of where I'm hoping that Dem Hub can get to. It's like, okay, I can deal with the pressing things, and I can also reach out to people who have the same pressing issues that I have, that have this very similar demographic of people that I'm serving and that I have to prepare for. On the other scale is like start the discussions going on about these larger, more long-term, what if type of scenarios, right? But also like the scientists and the academics and these other folks that are kind of that are thinking about these things, and that's their job. Their job is to consider these things, and if we can get those types of discussions rolling, then that ball's already in play. But what we do know is that for every dollar that we spend in the pre-disaster phase, we save 4 to 10 in the post-disaster. So where I could spend, and they'd spent $135 billion after Hurricane Katrina, I would have only had to have spent $13 billion. I mean, $13 billion is a lot of money. But whenever you're saying, can you compare these two I would take the $13 billion over the $135 billion.
The education should be more for the preventative side?
Right now we're very reactionary, and that was what Mark was saying. But if we start to play in an environment that is more along the lines of cooperation and this collaborative type of work, where not only am I doing it on a global scale, I have to make sure that my global activities emulate my local activities, either that or prepare for the worst, again, knowing that this is going to become a political issue.
Right.
And that's what a lot of emergency managers have been doing, is that they have been leveraging the political issue to get changes made.
How do you design a platform that hits a global scale, which also includes different ethnicities and cultures and languages, like
Google
open
Translate,
forum.
dude.
I was just going to say the same thing.
Dude,
Damn
that's
you.
the best thing. That's why digital is better, because you're gonna have
If
that
you have
translation.
access to this.
You can't talk to people like with your voice, because you're not going to be able to translate it. But if you can type into it, and it's going to automatically translate via Google, it's
That's what I'm
automatic
saying.
translation.
I'm trying to visualize this platform. It's not going to be like.
And not only that,
documentaries
you've got to
and
make sure that
visuals.
there's a cost benefit, right? So
Yeah.
that's what I'm proposing is a very altruistic, like we all want to contribute. But at the end of the day, it's like you've got to speak to the senses of ego. But it's also a contribution issue. So if you want to talk about certain things that are kind of futuristic, it's like we were always so afraid of the digital sphere, like it's like, oh, you can find out information about me, and I don't like that.
Yeah, it was like an invasive.
Yeah, it's like I'm being watched without knowing who's watching me. This is
Well,
kind
it
of
can
creepy,
be,
right?
yeah.
Right. So that was what they call the societies of control. So this isn't kind of like a philosophical point of view, right? So for cults and stuff.
Panopticon. Yeah.
Exactly. They were talking about like, here's the society of control, and I'm a fan of Stiegler, who's saying we're actually moving out of that, and we're moving into the economy of contribution. And we are now in a different mind frame of how can we get people to engage? How do we get people to contribute? And how does that contribution and that interaction make a significant change in the world that makes our global communities safer and more resilient?
And the more success you have, the end game is you can solve global problems now, because you have
exactly.
global collaboration
Together.
Like
So-
the scientists always bring that up whenever you see them talking to each other. Like, this is a global problem. No one country can solve this problem. No one person can. They don't have the resources. They don't even have the control or the power. Like, this is the only way to kind of circumvent.
But
Right.
I also think you'll lose the track that we can talk about global, but you can also lose the track about regional.
Yeah.
The fact that
It's beneficial
right
for all.
now, because we talked about how no disaster is the same, no two disasters are the same, but you think about Josh could be in Vancouver right now on Dem Hub, and we could be talking about the same thing, which a similar disaster in Vancouver to Toronto would potentially have the same consequences per se, or have the same similar responses, just because of just culture where we are geographically. And so even
similarities.
regional, even within cities, and that's the thing, is like sometimes it's not just on global, but just even in regions being able to connect. And it's interesting, like there's always a lot of things that come back, and the one key word that we talked about is urbanization, is what I wanted to talk about. And a lot of these things come down to it. And the one thing with the digital age with urbanization is more and more people are becoming connected, and the way social media is taking off. But the one thing that's happening too is like the younger generations, they talked about the younger generations are losing their ability of spontaneous conversation, their ability to actually face-to-face or over the telephone to really think on the spot. And I think that's a bad thing overall. But the one thing too is that Dem Hub and using the internet, these sites, allows people to have a voice. So some people who may like social anxiety, I believe, with younger people is on the rise.
Oh,
And
it most definitely is, and I think it has to do with social media usage.
Yeah, and so the one thing is that you have a lot of people with brilliant minds, and that's the one thing when you look at it, is that all these sites are allowing people to have voices, and this is just one specialization, and where it allows people to have a voice to come down, and like through Dem Hub, you might get the most unexpected person say the most unexpected thing, and have these experts turn around and be like, "Oh wow, that's
Never thought of it that way.
And then you go, and all of a sudden you're like, what's this person? This could be like an 18-year-old down.
I was just going to say
in
that.
Mexico, just being like, hey.
Stoner.
No, there's two relevant things that actually happened that way. The 16-year-old who developed the idea for using ocean currents to clean up our oceans is
big news.
being implemented in 2020 for the Eastern Pacific Garbage Patch. That was no PhD scientist or anything. It was just a teenager who had this idea.
And that's the
brought it
thing.
forward.
And that's what
the
you
right
want to
people
foster.
heard it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here's Mark, for example. I'm going to pick on Mark for a second. He wrote an awful lot of. He wrote quite a few papers on Haiti. So who's to say he doesn't just publish one of his? It by keyword gets filtered through. Somebody falls upon it, and just said, "Wait a second. This guy's onto something." This is something that we can actually do something with, because when he wrote it, it didn't have a whole lot of weight to it. But today that it's being read, it's it's as clear as day. And this is exactly what we've been trying to wrap our head around.
Amazing. So it's like archiving this human knowledge for this one specific area.
Exactly.
But one thing you brought up was changing people's perspective. So you said that you want to be a professional network. So these PhDs who probably also get paid a lot of money to do what they do. So in the digital world, you have to frame it like it's not free labor. So that's what you can't frame it as, okay, you're doing free labor. You're going to be spending time like translating or doing research, and you want to put on your research paper where you could have made money selling it as a book instead. It's how do we make sure this is collaborative and like, there's like a bigger meaning towards it, you know? It's not about free labor. It's like contributing to something much larger than yourself.
Absolutely. And there's also this other point to it too. I have, a graduate degree in digital media. So that's what I'm doing with Dem Hub is my area of specialty. And you're going to have a lot of people out there in just any type of situation and any type of industry that calls themselves a professional, like absolute expert in something. Well, you better be in a term like this. Like you better really know your stuff. Just know your stuff. Don't pretend that you know everything. Just know your stuff. And chances are that's going to be useful. But if you're blowing hot air, you're going to get called out on it. So it's going to clean up a lot of things that are misinterpreted and we need that because this is a life or death type of an industry.
That's actually one thing I wanted to get back to is when you talked about risk analysis. And the one thing that this site talked about the gated community and having not only professionals but also just open to the public is the fact that with the risk analysis, and what I wanted to say beforehand, and I wanted to use the deadly word, I wanted to be like, I would like to argue about the risk analysis, because what'll happen,
right?
What can happen is like we prioritize. So we have these things that and the budgets go accordingly, prioritize an area, and they're pretty, what I believe, somewhat effective. But at the same time is like when we talk about creeping disasters, but there's things within our societies that will contribute to things that are probably further down that we don't realize that are happening. And that's the one thing is having the public be in there is something that might be 4 or 5 or 6 down there. In the public side might be way more important. And trends can start happening when we talk about our food system, which is a big one, and it's something that I'm really pressing about when we talked about mega farms taking care of societies. That's just trying to answer to so-called urbanization. But what we don't look about, what I believe is actually a kind of creeping disaster, something leading to it, is food wastage. Food wastage is
I just was reading about that
ginormous.
today. It's especially with like the corporations, like you look at Loblaws, who just throw away like subpar food where they could give it away or sell it for cheaper.
Yeah. Well, in France, they passed the law now that makes it illegal for grocery stores to throw out food that isn't wasted. And the one thing is a rough number is roughly around 60% of perishable food items in grocery stores get thrown out annually within Western societies. A lot of people argue, and this is very Malthusian, they argue that our population is outgrowing the Earth's capacity, which I argue completely. I think civilization as we know it today and how the economics of everything and just we could actually sustain ourselves, but we just have to be more responsible about it. We need to be more aware about it.
And this is so optimistic. I really love this, and I really love what you're doing with Dem Hub because I mean, so many people are very pessimistic, like, there's just going to be a disaster, the world's going to end, something's going to happen, and we're not going to progress. But I think, not even just with technology, but also, culturally, I think we're all going to evolve further. And I think it's things like this where people are coming together that our whole world will actually evolve because it's not going to keep running the same way, right? There's going to be new technologies, new energy sources, and the world is going to completely evolve, and it's not just going to die.
What I love about your pessimism comment is the fact that you still want to hear from them. And that's the thing, even on, I think on the internet, we call them trolls, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the biggest thing is, even with Dem Hub, some people who are pessimistic will come on. And that's the whole thing is if you can get them to say their things, which a lot of points can be valid and can actually spark some good discussion, but it can also get them maybe being more optimistic, maybe thinking. And that's the one thing is if Dem Hub is put out there and it is a public network, it's not just like, well, LinkedIn is great, but it's there for jobs. Mm-hmm. It's there, you market, and you can connect. But one thing is that Dem Hub is specific. It wants a disaster emergency management. And the one thing that, to be honest, when I tell people what I graduated from, the minute they hear disaster in my line, sometimes I say emergency management just because I don't say disaster. Because when I say disaster emergency management, people are like, oh, what? They're like
avalanches.
Start making jokes about you doing your master's disaster, like master of disaster, and that's the one thing is it's like it is. what's beneficial for it is something that's eye-catching. It is something that has some like romanticism to it. It's seductive, it's sensationalist, and so it can get people interested to be like, what? This is kind of like a networking tool, like network, but I get to talk about all these things and open up
or learn about
table.
it. I want to just learn about these things. Like, as for me, as not a professional, like I want to go in here and just like learn, maybe talk, maybe spark some discussion. But right,
but that's the one thing.
Yeah, they're like
going back to what Josh says. I think that's most of my friends and people I talk to, and why they are nihilistic or pessimistic is because they think they don't have a voice and that they can't do anything. That's exactly what Dem Hub will solve. It's a solution for that. It gives you a voice. It gives you access to people who can take your idea to a next stage of transition where it can actually happen. And I think that's brilliant, and that's like the most optimistic thing about Dem Hub.
Well, the biggest thing a lot of times that I say to Jen is I always talk about how we have, especially here in Canada and in a lot of Western societies, is we have a lot of reliance on our government. So when emergencies happen and things go wrong, who's like generally first to blame? The government. It's like, what are they doing? Why these failings? And a lot of people expect that where we've come is this like basically this normalization of that. If something goes wrong, it's because the government hasn't done enough to protect me. And what I would like to see and could believe that Dem could be is like there's more belief in the individual and the communities at the ground level. A lot of research has been shown in disasters that the best first responders are actually citizens that have become the most effective in the face of adversity. And to try and give the means to empower people to develop their own resiliency within as an individuals and then as communities, I think is super important to sit there and be like, if something happens, they're not right away thinking, what's the government doing for me? They're thinking, what resources do I have right now to respond and help my community?
Exactly.
And that's the power of the collective.
Yeah, I think it's not who's going to come help me. Like, I feel lost. It's, okay, now I know what to do, or I've learned what to do, or I can go in Dem Hub and learn on the spot, what do I need to do? And I can actually help out instead of just sitting like a deer in the headlights and be like, I don't know what to do.
But it could already be there. We talk about mitigation and preparation. Dem Hub may have already created those networks, and it's not that. They just already know. They're like, there could be discussions already, and you never know what can happen. And that's what I also think Dem Hub can help do as well, is to take away that onus that the government is the be and end all.
Totally. And I think it's also important to not just talk about it, but put these things in action, where it's like, sure, people can sit in a room and talk about it, but like that information needs to be used, otherwise it's useless knowledge. You need to create wisdom, not just accumulate knowledge, right?
And the more disasters and things that happen over time, the more things like the things that they talk about are going to be used, and then that's how you find out which things work and which things don't, because some things aren't going to work that they're going to discuss and they can implement and try and like, okay, that was a huge failure. But as soon as it's failed, it'll be archived and stored, and so that they won't do the exact same bad thing.
Put a failure tag on it. So like, no, this doesn't work. It's not, don't get rid of it. It's like, put it under.
Just so you can always try to find the best.
Because you need to look back
possible.
and be like, hey, this didn't work.
And that might be it's very probable that could happen. And it could be that it failed because of one of many reasons, right? It might not always have been a failure, but under these conditions it was.
And say, these were the conditions, this is how it failed,
and
this
that
is why it
is
didn't
success.
work.
Like in that way, that would have been a success, right? Like those are the types of things that we'll be able to do. And one of the other things too is that it's very reactionary. So you'll have, for example, like just recently, we had the attack on Brussels, which is a terrorism issue. And a lot of people will actually argue and say terrorism is not a disaster issue. It's not an emergency management issue. But what it is in the response and the recovery part of it. It becomes an issue, and how much can we plan for? So those are the types of things, because it is a geopolitical issue. Terrorism is, and it's undisputable now, it's a geopolitical issue. And so there's nothing that we can do to actually prevent it as far as we are concerned, right? But now it seems as though, Paris attacks in Brussels and who knows what's coming up next. And that's an actual fact. And then some people, in my argument, is like, should we be actually recording things right after a terrorist attack? Is that not inciting more terror in a place that I'm quite familiar with? So now I see my local airport and what it would look like if it was under attack or if it had just been attacked. And that kind of incites a fear in me that now is actually doing a lot of is actually doing some of the work that the terrorists would have you do. So it's like using this very medium as a way of saying, hey, this is what happened, but I'm now helping get that message out there that you need to be terrified of us.
Well, isn't that what like just the regular media and the regular news already does? Like, hey, fear, this happened over there, it could happen over here. I think you want to do something different with the media.
But this is the way that we can actually put messages out there and say, hey, when this happens, don't do this.
Oh, okay.
Right? Don't do that. You can record it, and then we can see what, like, that information is very useful, but don't just post it. Don't be irresponsible with that type of data. Because it's data, it's information, and you're just throwing it out there for sensational purposes or to let people know that you're okay when you've got 2 dead people in the frame. Like, this isn't okay. And so that's the way that we bring our messages up, and that's how we have to start to talk, to say, tell your constituents, don't do that.
And that's the one thing when you talk about, you brought up terrorism, which is a very, very important and pertinent issue right now, is that media is their number one weapon. And they're very media savvy, and that's the one thing. And so
they all have like GoPros and stuff.
Well, just they know how they want the average person to take a snap photo and put it on the web. They want those kind of things to happen, and it's a tough discussion. Like if we start discussing it, because there could be also, do we need to try and change our collective perceptions about fear? And when someone puts something up, how we have this fear-mongering that happens, but like start discussing how we need to maybe start to embrace it in order to kind of, I don't want to say win, but to deal with the effects of terrorism, to minimize it per se. Yeah, it's interesting. And the one thing when we talk about social is, I don't know why it just popped into me, but I thought the other day, I've thought many times, is like, I really hope this site would bring on a lot of social workers. Because I actually believe in emergency management. Social workers get the raw end of the deal.
People who work with the actual people.
They make no money. They get very little recognition.
And they have to be there. They have to be. I've seen them. They're exhausted. Not only do they have to work the disaster, then they have to go back and do their day-to-day. So I'm hoping, there's a lot of hope for Dem Hub. But we're at this beautiful stage in developing a platform where we've got the most minimal viable product. And the response we get is going to be slow, like just implementing one thing at a time that people want and people need. And once we figure out what that is, then set sail for any of the possibilities.
Right. And that's creating a good user experience for the users who are using it. And what do they actually need this for? What do they want it for? And what do they want to contribute?
It should be built by the community and used by the community.
I think it's going to be a springboard. And that's the one thing, is like, I think it's just scratching the bottom of the barrel, and it's going to be a springboard for a lot of ideas that are even on the technology level that you're going to see happen, especially with the way that mobile phones are working with apps and everything. But I know we're running out of time. Yeah. But I really do believe that it could be a springboard for a lot of good and benefits.
I think so too. I think it's going to really foster more innovation than you think, because people are going to use it in unexpected ways. And I really can't wait to see where Dem Hub goes. And just before we wrap up, is there anything you want to plug? Any of you guys?
Anything you want to?
Anyway,
one last thing you want to say?
One more thing you want to say, and just you're going to put out to the world. People are just going to hear this.
Jump on the demhub.net website and create your own profile and start to engage and let us know what you think. And if there's anything that comes to mind, we're completely wide open right now. It's all about user experience, and we're hoping to launch by November 2017. So we've got plenty of time to get that feedback in and to develop it in a way that's sustainable for a longer period of time, for as long as we could possibly run it. And hopefully it becomes the very thing that we're all talking about today.
And how can people contact you? How do they reach you on the internet?
Well, it's Jen Duke Holmes, JenDukeholmes @demhub.net.
All right, it's been a pleasure having you guys on.
Thanks for having us.
Is there anything you want to add, Mark?
No, I'm very excited. I wanted to let Jen have the go ahead on the plug-in there.
Is there anything you're working on? Anything like special? Anything cool that you've come across?
Well, there's stuff that I don't want to go in detail with, but I have some ideas with mobile applications that I think can be, as we move forward, Dem Hub can really help foster and be innovative and to get ideas off the ground. That's what I think is like a lot of things, is like Dem Hub can be the hub to splinter off from some great ideas and have a collective of great minds come up with tools that can help in situations and help in situations of adversity that we call emergencies. And I just really think it's important, and it'll be a great resource overall.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, guys.
Yeah, it's been a
Thank you
pleasure.
for having
Thanks,
me.
guys.
We'll have to
really
do it again.
appreciate it. Yeah.
Exactly.
for sure.
We
Awesome.
both love to talk.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.
If you enjoyed this talk and want to check out more, go to our website at thinktankcast.com and subscribe with your email so we can send you all of the latest episodes, news, and updates right to your inbox.
Also, on our website, there will be show notes for this episode, some links to the things that we talked about, and more detailed information on our guests. If you want to see the video of this episode, it'll be on our YouTube channel, which is also linked on our website.
And if you want to keep in touch, we're on social media. Check us out on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're at ThinkTankCast on pretty much everything, so you can find us on the web. And all of these details, again, will be linked to our website at thinktankcast.com. Hope to hear from you guys soon.
Amplified pattern recognition.
Why does the universe exist?
Perspective.
We're about 5 Einsteins away from 10 answers.